I'm going to bring on my man, Caleb Maupin. He is in the background. How you doing, Caleb? You doing okay today?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I'm doing okay. I can't complain. I'm puttering just fine. Caleb Maupin. He's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author. Caleb also started the Center for Political Innovation. They have all sorts. It's an active organization. They're not a talking shop. They actually go out, do protests and everything else. Caleb, what is your latest book? Because you write books like.
Yeah, it's called Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, the whole story. And it's doing quite well. It remains a top new release on Amazon. So it tells the story of how the war hawks in Washington, D.C., the people that brought us the Bush administration, and the people that at this point seem to be at odds with our current administration, how they have roots in a break with Trotskyism in the late 1930s. So, yeah.
I brought you on for Venezuela, but there was another issue that came up that I really want your take on because I'm fast. Like, you would be a good person to break this down. Nepal. So Nepal has effectively caught on fire, and you have the parliament building being burned down. You have politicians' houses being burned down. You have the president, or the prime minister, Ali, step down. 22 people, I think it was either 19 to 22 people were killed, including the former prime minister's wife, who was burned alive in the house as they celebrated and burned the house to the ground. And all of this was started, for all intents and purposes, because social media companies didn't want to follow the laws of Nepal. And when Nepal responded to them by limiting the capability of the social media companies in Nepal, you got this massive blow up from kids, backed by an organization called Hamai Nepal. Now, this is funded in part by Coca-Cola, for one, but it's several organizations, but it's also funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, or at the very least it was funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, with this kind of organization called Free Tibet, which is obviously an anti-China organization. Now, I don't believe for a moment that the people who are out there protesting know that. By the same token, they turned around and attacked the organs of state. Now, what they were chanting was effectively corruption, grift. Their kids are looking well, but we live these difficult, desperate lives. But look at how the elites are living in the country, basically a immiseration of the poor in the country itself. And all of this stuff was effectively marshaled, mostly kids, to destroy organs of state. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because what's interesting to me is I feel that, if I'm being bluntly honest with you, when I look at, them passing a bill where they're taking $1 trillion out of healthcare in a country that barely has healthcare in order to give the rich more cash, okay, that's angry, right? That's enraging in the way that that works. When I see them going after Medicaid or Medicare, and I had a grandmother that needed Medicaid, and it was insufficient, even in the way that it was. And now they're firing people from Social Security, making people's lives that much more difficult. Like, we have a political situation that has a tenure to the actual needs of the population, which creates rage. It creates an antagonism against the organs of state. And in the same way that the people in Nepal felt that rage, and that rage was effectively taken out by destroying those organs of state, I get where they're coming from, even though, let's be honest, this is somewhat of a regime change, color revolution type environment. How do you navigate that? The rage is real. The maneuvering is something different. Those kids don't know any better. From their point of view, they're getting off their frustrations at what they consider to be a distance or distinction between their life versus the life of the state that, from their point of view, has abandoned them. We feel that in America too, though. That's not something different. And yet those kids are being maneuvered for other reasons that they may not necessarily entirely be aware of. How is that maneuvered, especially since many of these kids are lefties?
Well, as you pointed out, I view this as geopolitics. When I was in Russia, I attended the World Conference of Parliamentarians, and there were a number of political leaders from Eurasia, from Kazakhstan, from various parts of the Central Asian countries, also, people from the Middle East, and many, many leaders are concerned about the mental health impact of social media, and that these countries are in very different circumstances than we're in. And here in the West, we're having big problems too. I mean, the big thing that I've seen in social media the last, 24 hours has been a call for racial profiling. And that the mental health is going crazy in response to this horrendous murder that happened. I mean, and so I imagine in a developing country where there's a lot of poverty, where there's a lot of instability, the impact of social media and the concern that political leaders might have about what it could do to younger people is going to be much more, especially in a much more socially conservative society. So that's a big concern. This to me looks like you said, like geopolitical games. Nepal is a country that, they had a monarchy for many years, and there was a Maoist communist insurgency against that monarchy. And then the king stepped down. And since the king stepped down, they've had democratic elections. The communists have done pretty well in those democratic elections, but they're not the only party. There's the Congress Party, which is kind of like, more of a mainstream, like Western party. And then there's the Maoist Communist Party that's aligned with some other communist parties too. There's a number of different communist parties. There's the United Marxist-Leninist Party. There's the Worker and Peasants Party. And that, Nepal is very close to China, and India is also on its border. And there's kind of a push and pull between India and China over Nepal. And so the Maoist communists, even though they tend to view China as not in line with their ideology, they're more like hardcore. They tend to be sympathetic to China, whereas Nepal would like to exercise some kind of control over India. And Nepal has often felt that India is trying to control them. And so Nepal is a country that is heavily contested, and there's a lot of political forces there, and they have pivoted pretty strongly into the pro-China camp. And in that context, you had this debate about social media, and now we see this rioting. And as you pointed out, brought to you by Western institutions. But that doesn't mean, as you also pointed out, that there aren't legitimate grievances that these young people have and frustrations that fueled it. But ultimately, this is being manipulated by the West. And it's funny because that's actually kind of what my book about Trotskyism kind of gets about. The neocons are very, very good at hijacking leftist sentiments to serve regime change and to spread the Western system, foment discontent against anti-imperialist governments. But yeah, I look at this and it's like, again, as you said, there are probably legitimate grievances against the government, but the main issue at hand is they want Western social media in Nepal, and they are being used by Western forces to try and bring down a government that might get in their way and has been pretty close to China and has been kind of cooperating with China. So it's a complex situation. And that doesn't mean that, something good might not come out of this. Who knows? Maybe there'll be a faction that's able to capture this and pivot Nepal in a more anti-imperialist direction. You never know.
Yeah.
But on the surface of this looks like a color revolution fomented by Western social media outlets to try and pivot Nepal away from China, to try and get Nepal into the U.S. camp. And it doesn't look like a good development at all.
No, it doesn't. I mean, the Victoria Nuland apparently was there a couple of years ago trying to make the case, hey, you need to side with the United States as opposed to China. You have Nepal part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's that. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in regards to where they were leaning, they were obviously leaning into the direction of China. And China, of course, wants them for the Belt and Road Initiative and the projects associated with the Belt and Road Initiative. And I guess the catch becomes, who will be the next prime minister? Who is going to take power? And where is that guy's head going to be after they take power? So, and by the way, one more thing. I was there when the monarchy fell. I was in Nepal when the king left. Yeah. I was traveling around the world. I just so happened to jump into Nepal. I was going bungee jumping. And there was this tension because they had just told the king to leave. And nobody was sure whether or not the king was going to actually leave. And the guy who ran the hotel, he was kind of giving me a breakdown of what took place. The king murdered his brother, or let's say he wasn't king at the time, but he murdered his brother. He became king. He looted the treasury, effectively robbed the country blind. Parliament finally told him to leave, and they gave him X amount of days to do so. And we were waiting bated breath on whether he was going to do it or whether there was going to be some kind of more aggressive response. He packed his stuff and left. Packed his
Wow.
stuff and left.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, Nepal is interesting politically because it is very much, you know, communism was the main resistance to the king. I mean, it was the Maoist rebels. And, you know, I mean, I also understand one of the smaller communist parties in Nepal is the Worker and Peasants Party of Nepal. And they are very closely aligned with North Korea. And there is like a smaller city that they dominate, where they have big pictures of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il and such. And it's almost just like seen as like a Juche, like pro North Korean city in Nepal.
Yeah.
The other thing is the major Maoist rebel group, the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist, that was waging, you know, armed struggle against the government for many years. They were at one point aligned with a communist group in the United States called the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP. And I actually heard from some tourists who had been there. They told the ironic story of they were in a restaurant in Nepal, and you know, they asked, like, you know, the waiter said, "Oh, where are you from?" And they said, "America." And they said, "Oh, like Bob Avakian," referring to the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party. And they thought, what in the world is this? This is like some obscure communist guy in America. And yet in this restaurant in Nepal, like, you say America and they say, "Oh, you mean like, you know, this guy," you know, and it was just kind of like, you know, they thought it was kind of odd that, you know, and that communism is very much, I mean, Nepal, you still had at least feudal relations in the countryside. And, you know, they were waging a war kind of modeled on what Mao had done in the 1930s with the peasants rising up against the landowners, land redistribution, that kind of thing. And the rights of women was a big part of the Maoist insurgency. The Maoist communists were really into empowering women and granting women equality and such. And that, you know, and it was funny. I remember when I was in college when the king stepped down, you know, or I wasn't when the king stepped down. I think it was when they had the elections. And there were the two guys at my college that were Nepalis. And they were, when I asked them about, you know, before the king had stepped down, when it was still a monarchy, I said to them, "What do you think of the Maoists?" And they said, "Oh, they're horrible. They're terrorists or whatever." But then after the king stepped down, I said, "What do you think of them?" And they actually they had changed their opinion. And they said, "You know what? I hope they make a better country. Maybe they'll change things, you know." And I was like, "Wow." You know, I said, "You guys have changed." And they said, "Well, things in Nepal are changing really quick," and all of that. And they were actually quite optimistic when Prachanda first took office. And I was like, "Wow, you guys had been so hostile before." And they said, "Yeah, but things are just changing very quickly." And I thought that was kind of amazing to see that they kind of changed their perspective so quickly. So I don't know. I mean, again, these are countries in the developing world where the politics are not something we can really relate to. You know, and that, you know, when we think of radical politics in America, people get interested in these kind of radical politics because they want to be trendy, because it's like a niche interest. But in a lot of these developing countries, people join nationalist political parties or communist political parties or socialist political parties or Islamic political parties because it's a matter of survival, right? They're in an area and that is the group that is feeding people. That is the group that is offering armed protection. It's very different than how we view politics over here, you know? And a lot of times I tell people to remember that, you know, when people come to the United States, they tend to say very negative things about governments that they've come from. But you have to remember, those are people that are on one side of a war. And people that are on one side of a war tend to have that perspective. And there tend to be two sides in wars. And that we you know, we in the West, some of us that are bookish and academic, we can project our own life experience and say, well, you know, if I was living there, you know, I would be in this group. But it's not like that, right? Again, this is a matter of survival. These are people that are joining a group because it offers them protection, and that a lot of times what side you're on in a civil war is based on, you know, what region you're from, what family you're in, et cetera. It's not based on some kind of intellectual, you know, digestion of the ideas of the people, you know. That's one thing that it's important to keep in mind, that in a lot of ways, those of us in the West that are exploring politics, it's an intellectual exercise to us, but for people in the developing world, it's a matter of survival, and that makes the politics take on a very different dimension.
I think the thing that concerns me more than anything else is the ease at which people can be maneuvered. Because, you know, it's not like how they feel is fake. How they feel is real. It's not like their lived experience is fake. Their lived experience is real. And many of these people are probably liberals on some level. And let's even take the liberal stuff up. From their point of view, this society should be better. And they are corrupt officials at the top. Okay, but see, from my point of view, that's the same thing here. That's the same thing in France. That's the same thing pretty much in the developing world. I don't know. It just, I think to myself, that rage, I would be susceptible to that rage every bit as much as anybody else. I feel it now in the way that our government operates.
Well, there's a couple things that are important. First of all, I mean, the anti-corruption thing, that is a staple of Barack Obama and a staple of George Soros. They have really got that down to you hate corruption. And, what is corruption? I mean, corruption is a vague term. It's hard to define. And especially in an impoverished country, politicians are expected to take care of their friends. And, I mean, Venezuela has had big issues in the past. And part of the problem that Venezuela had was that, when the oil money was very, very high, people didn't seem to notice. But when there was scarcity, people that were politically connected took care of their friends and relatives. And that made people that weren't politically connected quite angry. But an important thing to remember, and this is something I always point out to people, wealth is not bad. We are not anti-wealth. We're anti-poverty, right? We're anti people getting rich by making other people poor. But wealth itself is not bad. And that, the Panama Papers and a lot of the documents that are used to kind of foment these color revolutions, they just focus on, well, this political leader, their family member has a Manhattan apartment or has a lot of money and all of that. Doesn't that make you mad? And that a lot of us on the so-called left, we're kind of trained to like, oh yeah, we hate rich people, right? Well, we don't hate rich people. No, we just are opposed to people who get rich by making other people poor. And we're opposed to an economic system where wealth and poverty walk hand in hand. We want opportunity for everyone. But if your mindset is, well, I hate rich people, all you have to do is, dump a bunch of documents showing, oh, well, this politician is rich and they have a lot of wealth. Oh my God, I can't believe it. And that is kind of how it works. I saw how they took down Isabel dos Santos, who was the popular leader of Angola, and they showed that she's rich. I mean, she's very, very wealthy, but her, running of the state-run oil company in Angola led to millions of people being lifted out of poverty, facilitating, Chinese investment and building railroads. And they've replaced her with neoliberal folks that are also quite wealthy and are taking good care of themselves while they do the opposite and impoverish Angola. And that this kind of like, color revolution narrative, it's always, well, these leaders are so corrupt, they're taking care of themselves, so go out and riot. And then they get replaced with leaders that do what the United States wants and also enrich themselves. So, I mean, it's just, it's a game that they've learned to play. But, I mean, resentment, jealousy, envy, these are things that can't really lead to anything good, right? We can be outraged about injustice. We can be outraged about people gaining at others' expense. We can be outraged about a situation where people are being held back and held down. But we're not simply jealous of people having more wealth than others, and we're not thinking that wealth itself is inherently bad, and that those are dangerous things. When you create a mindset of like, the white world sucks for me, and there's somebody else for whom the world does not suck as much, so I want to take them down to make things fair. That's a really bad, unhealthy way of being. And unfortunately, in a lot of people's minds, that's what being a leftist or a socialist or a communist is, right? And that is quite dangerous. And those emotions can't really lead to anything good. And that's one thing I've learned over the years. I mean, it's just, you have to view things and in terms of what I want for myself, I want for all mankind, right? That needs to be your attitude. And, obviously you want an economic system where opportunity is available for all, where human creativity is unleashed, and that this is really, when it comes to Marx, what I get from Marx is that human beings have this brilliant ability that no other species has to make the environment serve them and to reinvent their relationship with nature to reach a higher mode of production, right? We've gone from hunter-gatherer civilization to, we domesticated animals and we started growing our own crops and, the Industrial Revolution and all of that. We are constantly reinventing our relationship with nature. And that right now, the capitalist mode of production has an inherent problem, which is that the more wealth that's created, the poorer people get. And that is the problem, is that we shouldn't have a system where self-driving cars would be a bad thing. Self-driving cars should be a good thing. We should have a society where the fact that this chore called driving is no longer necessary leads to wealth
Yes.
and abundance on a higher scale. But we have a system where self-driving cars would lead to mass poverty. That's the problem, is we need a rationally organized economy to unleash human creativity so that people can go out and invent and become wealthier. We don't want to get rid of wealth. And that's a hard thing for people to wrap their minds around, because we're taught that socialism is the redistribution of wealth. It's taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Well, no, it's actually reorganizing the economic system. So the irrationality of the market is not in command.
Yes. Oh, you speak my language. No, I agree with you. I mean, like, I would make the argument that robots are there to serve, or technology is there to serve humanity.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have this kind of weird system where the moment that you create a technological device, human beings are competing against the device in a way that it's to their detriment. You know, it's very strange. Like, it's one thing if you have a self-driving car that can get to from point A to point B. The issue is not the car. The issue is that there's going to be some individual who owns that company that is going to charge you a hell of a lot, and it's going to put all of these people out of work the moment that they create this technology. No, I agree with you 1,000% on this.
Yeah, we shouldn't have a system where people can become homeless because too much food is produced, where people can become hungry because there's too much housing, right? And that's the problem in America right now. There is no housing shortage. I hear this, there's a housing shortage. There's no housing shortage. It's just too expensive. We can't afford to live in it. You know, and they've got all these mechanisms to drive the price of real estate up. While there's more demand than ever, people need places to live, but yet they continue to drive the price of rent up. And what we need more than anything, especially in the urban centers in America, I think, is we need a tax on empty housing units, right? If you're a landlord and you have empty housing units, you should have to pay a tax on that. And that would drive landlords to want to fill up their apartments, so they would lower the rent because they want to fill them up. Right now, landlords and big real estate companies, they make profit off of housing without anyone actually living there. It's like gambling on the stock exchange, right? That they buy the property and they wait for the market to change, and then they sell it. And no one has to actually rent and live in the building in order to make profits. And if you lower the rent to make it affordable, that makes the property value go down, right? So they're constantly trying to figure out how they can make the buildings more expensive so they can sell them and make more money, and no one's actually living in them. You know, in New York City, we have what's called Billionaires Row. I've done stories on it. The most expensive apartment buildings in the world. And the tragedy of them is that nobody lives in them. They're empty. I mean, it's like, you know, like they're almost half empty. These huge towers, these luxury buildings, and at least half of the units, nobody lives in them, because who can afford $2 million a month in rent? Nobody, right? And it's like, this is a crime. Why do we have these huge luxury apartment buildings empty when we have all kinds of people in this city who are struggling to put together, you know, $2,000 for a one-bedroom apartment in Queens or in the Bronx or something? I mean, it's just absolutely wrong, and it doesn't fit the market, right? In the market model is supposed to be supply and demand. If there's people that need housing, the prices should go down because there's more demand. But it's been rigged through real estate speculation to not deliver what the consumer wants.
I'm curious on something else. I think, look, I agree with you about the wealth thing, but I think people inherently know that somebody else has, or the reason that I don't have on some level is because somebody else has. Like, that it's not a one-to-one. It's not like this person has billions and this other person can also have billions. It's this person has billions because I don't have. And people make that relationship. As you point out, it's the way the system effectively works. It creates an alienation with the government itself. Like, it creates this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? This hatred, this anger at a particular system and the way the system operates. And I think what we're seeing in Nepal is people taking that rage and that frustration out on these buildings, on these levers of government that from their point of view, they're A, alienated from, and B, blame for the situation that they found themselves in regards to the difficulty to which they're experiencing. Why do you think that hasn't happened in the States?
Well, I mean, it has. I mean, they've staged these kind of things. I was part of Occupy Wall Street, and that very much came from above, no question about it. I mean, that was, you know, I had been part of smaller demonstrations before, like Bloombergville, which was like kind of the rehearsal for Occupy Wall Street that got almost no publicity. That was like we'd occupied a lower part of Manhattan in response to Bloomberg's budget cuts in New York City. But, you know, Occupy Wall Street was very much, it was the National Endowment for Democracy. It was the George Soros people, and they staged a protest But, we were able to go into it, and I met a lot of people who got politically active for the first time during Occupy Wall Street. And that's to say, sometimes things can go in a different direction. Fomenting dissent and unrest is kind of playing with fire to some degree or other. And I think of great examples. For example, when Fidel Castro first came to power, the CIA was backing him. Right. At first, they opposed him and they supported Batista. But then when it became clear he was going to win, the USA started supporting him, actually. And they pivoted towards supporting him. And they thought, OK, this guy will, he'll be our guy. And, maybe we just need to reform things in Cuba. But then when it became clear, he was going to pivot towards supporting the Soviet Union, then they turned against him. But, the Houthis, I have my book on the Houthis. The turning point for the Houthis was the Arab Spring, right? Which was, we also know, was fomented by the U.S. government, was fomented by the National Endowment for Democracy. But Yemen's a very corrupt country, and they had been this religious fanatical group that controlled certain territories and had militias. But then there was the Arab Spring, which was this kind of anti-corruption uprising. But the Houthis were able to start providing security for the protesters during the Arab Spring. And they won over a lot of the more liberal people in the country who didn't agree with them religiously by being there like security guards and protecting them during the Arab Spring protests. And now the Houthis run Yemen. So sometimes you can have like a color revolution that they kind of lose control over, right? And that happens too, right? And who knows? I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't look good in Nepal right now, but who's to say that, this unrest might lead to a situation where some anti-imperialist force could get control of the unrest and take it in a good direction. These things happen. In Iran a couple years ago, there was a protest movement that started out as legit grievances against the reforms. It was against banking. They have liberalized their banking system in Iran to some degree or other. And then, there was some people that lost their money or whatever. And so there was like a protest, and the protest was not against the Islamic Republic. It was demanding that the Islamic Republic be pure to its kind of anti-capitalist principles, not capitalism, but Islam. But then the anti-regime forces, backed by the United States, they all jumped in and made it about opposing the Iranian government, supporting the United States. And then they were able to calm things down. And then the hardliners in Iran did have big actions, demonstrations as things calm down, kind of reinforcing, that the Islamic Republic takes care of the poor and such. And so it's not always a done deal. And that sometimes these unrest situations start out as something the imperialists foment for their own reasons, but then they go in another direction. And that's important to keep in mind as well. So it's complicated. I think that the main thing, though, that to remember is that right now, it almost seems like the forces in the developing world that are anti-imperialist, they almost have a conservatism to them. They're offering stability. They're saying, we will control the means of production and rationally organize the economy and make sure that living standards keep going up. But they're also saying we won't bring in all that chaos from the West, right?
Right.
We're going to protect the traditional family. We're going to, keep things stable. And so it's almost like socialism, communism, anti-imperialism has this kind of conservative edge to it, whereas the kind of the radical aesthetic, the red flag and the anger and the tear it down, that has become kind of the tool of the West, and it's fomented with social media. And that's kind of an interesting development. And I traced that over the course of the Cold War. You can see that kind of gradually became the case, whereas, the Trotskyists, they were all about permanent revolution, and the Soviet Union kind of pivoted away from how they saw things, and they eventually ended up with the CIA, whereas socialism in one country, which was Stalin's vision, and eventually socialism with Chinese characteristics and Deng Xiaoping, and that socialism gradually got more and more conservative as the Cold War went on, actual existing socialism, whereas leftism in the West became less and less anti-imperialist and more associated with, just kind of that radical aesthetic that ended up serving imperialism. And that's something I've written about quite a bit, that there's almost two souls of socialism. On the one hand, you have the radical intellectual who wants chaos and is angry at injustice. On the other hand, you have the bulk of the population that wants stability and become radicalized when their life is intolerable, and they're revolting because they want stability, because their life has just gotten so intolerable. They want stability, and they turn to socialists and radicals because they will promise to bring stability. I mean, the Russian Revolution promised what? Peace, land, and bread.
Right. Yep.
Yep. And that in China, it was land to the tiller. They were going to give land to the peasant. And that in a lot of cases, the actual demands that revolutionary governments come to power on the basis of are quite modest and moderate. I often will point to, North Korea when they took power, when the Korean Workers' Party took power, Kim Il-sung, I have the works of Kim Il-sung. There's a radio speech that Kim Il-sung gave when they announced that the Korean Workers' Party was coming to power. And he announced what they were for. And if you look at it, it's a very, very modest set of demands. It's not the most radical thing. He said, punish those who collaborated with Japan during the Second World War, create a national healthcare system, ensure freedom of religion, create movie theaters in rural areas where people can go to the movies. It's not the most radical thing. He's not promising I'm going to build some communist utopia. He's saying, here's some pretty basic things, but it was those basic things that brought them to power, right? And that the situation on the Korean Peninsula when Japan was occupying it and afterwards, they weren't getting that. There wasn't a universal public education system. There wasn't healthcare, and Kim Il-sung was saying, look, I can offer this. And the 14-point plan that the Korean Workers' Party had when they took power was very, very moderate, but it led to the North Korean government coming into power.
Wow. Caleb, I'm sorry we ended up being diverted for the Nepal thing, because
okay.
It was just on the marquee, and I was very curious about your take on it, especially with your political leanings on the way the protests and everything else and how you process that. I was just interested in your take on that. So thank you for this.
Sure.
Much appreciated, man. Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst. He is creator of Center for Political Innovation. Definitely check them out. They're very active political organization. And one more time, Caleb, what is your latest book so the audience can see it?
Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, the whole story. So yeah, check it out.
Badass, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it. You be safe.
Yeah. Always fun. Yep. Thanks.
Bye-bye. All right. Caleb Maupin. Caleb is